Hello and welcome to day 5 of the ISC Women's Sports Business Week. I'm Andrew James, and our guest for this webinar, focusing on growth, development, challenges and opportunities in women's sport in South Africa, is Chris Fortuin, a consultant on sport management, sport development and facility management, and previously a lecturer in the subject at the University of Johannesburg. We'll be looking at the historical perspective around apartheid and the modern era, where we are now in a democratic South Africa. Where are the growth and development sectors in women's sport in South Africa, the challenges, the opportunities, and how will success be measured? Chris, a very warm welcome to this. It's great to have you along. Let's reflect, first of all, on history, if we can. Major changes over the last 50 years or so, of course, starting with the abolition of apartheid. But looking back on those years, what did the sporting scene look like for women and girls then?
Look, the history of South Africa is in one sense it's a bit sad, because there was a marginalization of so-called non-white people on the whole. So if we're looking at the marginalization and oppression of the so-called black people in South Africa prior to our democratic elections in 1994, if men had faced the challenges of being incarcerated in prisons and fed off into Robben Island like Nelson Mandela and so-called top black leaders, then you can imagine what women and girls would be going through. So there was no breach in a situation where men of all colors could play a sport amongst each other. So you understand that women were even further marginalized. The challenges we faced then, and now it's rearing its ugly head in South Africa, is about the murders that took place during this period of protagonists against the oppression of divide and rule situation. So we still existing in a patriarchal society where we have this dominance of males. You can imagine what happened prior to 1994. So girls were not even allowed to participate in any code of sport. No, nevertheless, men. So the most important sports then were obviously football, because it was an easier sport to play. So the non-white groupings, South Africa has some groupings in indigenous tribes, or the black grouping. You have an Indian grouping coming from the slave era of India. You have a Chinese grouping also coming from the slave era that worked on the railways. And then you have a mixed breed of people where we all come from, and that's called the so-called colored people. So we were not allowed to play a game like rugby, because the Springbok emblem then was looked as a form of oppression symbol, And in the past, we always aligned ourselves. I come from a teaching background, and we always used to preach the principle of non-racialism. This is why we all had played under the banner of the so-called South African Council of Sport, SACOS, who had a slogan called "No normal sport in an abnormal society." So what we really portrayed or tried to get the message across was that we were fighting against the system of apartheid. So we were not allowed to play rugby. Rugby was only exclusive for white people. Cricket, hockey, and all those. So you could imagine football in that era, in those times, was unheard of for young girls or for women to play football. So those were the challenges that we faced then, And coming into a new democratic society in 1994, little had changed, because it was just now that people would be free to live where they could, where they had a voice to raise things like that. But the patriarchal society, and also, you must also understand that amongst the so-called non-white groupings, there was also a heavy issue of male culture. The patriarchal male culture, that women should be only confined to the space of the home and the kitchen, and girls had to be bred to have babies to keep the family going. So that spilled over, and we're only starting to see now in the 20s that things are changing, but very, very, very slightly.
So, in terms of Nelson Mandela, he made some famous statements, of course, about sport, didn't he? Saying that
Correct.
it has the power to change lives and that kind of thing. Um, are we seeing any of that? You're saying it's changing very slowly. There are some growth areas, I suppose, aren't there? I was looking
There
at
is.
rugby union launching a super league and football expanding its super league. Are those just little tips of the iceberg, though? Would you like to see more being done?
I think we need to be much more can be done. If you look at the growth of rugby, and in comparison to women's rugby, the women's Springboks and the men's Springboks, there is a big difference. I mean, our under 20 just won our under 20 Springbok baby box won last week. They won the World Cup. But our women are struggling very, very, very much because there is no growth from the bottom up. The rugby structure is one of the very most well organized structures, rugby and cricket in South Africa, where they start looking at younger development and growth from a younger age, from even an age of 7, which is also in Europe in terms of football. Still in South Africa, the growth of women's football has improved, but we do not still have academy structures or junior football. So young girls are only starting to play football at the age of maximum when they go to university or when they get to a certain level at high school. So that we're looking at between the ages of 15 and 17, and then development is too late. So the growth factor should actually go down back into the roots where we have this situation, where we have a sporadic influence on young girls. Another challenge that we face about growth and development of women's sport in South Africa is the lack of physical education in schools. Now, when we were at school, and I'm a physical education specialist by trade, we we had specific periods allocated to us in school in the curriculum. But after the democratic society, after our democratic elections in 1994, a lot of focus had shifted away from physical education, health, and wellness to a more academic side. So that also contributed to the retardation of women's participation in sport, you see.
There's been a policy across men's sport, perhaps in South Africa, around hosting big tournaments, hasn't there, in terms of football's World Cup and, as you say, the protest with the rugby fairly soon after
Yeah.
1994. So, is that a way forward potentially for women, or are you saying that perhaps no, we need to focus on grassroots development, we need to focus on schools, and actually one big tournament like the 2023 Women's T20 World Cup in cricket, it's just a showcase, but actually it doesn't have any
Yeah.
impact on the ground?
It never had the 2023 Women's World Cup in the Western Cape didn't have a major impact because it's not a sport played by the majority of people. You understand, cricket is a very expensive sport, so you have very few girls that would participate unless you look at the private schools, and most of the girls participating in cricket are all at private schools in South Africa. But the public system in South Africa, we have a very big challenge in terms of there's no physical education, there's no encouragement. So the grassroots participation of women in sport is stunned severely. And only if that is addressed, I know the new Minister of Sport is making a lot of statements publicly about, getting women's sport. I know today we are going to attend a function in the local area that we are, where he's handing out sporting kits and equipment to teams, to young girls teams that are participating in football, rugby, cricket, things like that. But again, the focus is very narrow in terms of women's growth and development in sport. So we have in isolation, we have in athletics, they rise in very quick because it's an individual sport. Athletics, so there's a lot of young girls that are starting to show their prowess and their expertise in the international arena. In the sports like swimming, which was only a so-called white sport in the past, very, very few black swimmers are really donning the Springbok or the Protea emblem. A very good example is we have rowing, which has now taken off as a very very well in most of the schools, but it's also an expensive sport because you need a boat, you need, and funny enough we have one black Olympian, Lawrence Sizwe in Glovo, who's one of my ex-students basically, that has won gold in the 2012 Olympics. So if you use that as a measuring stick, uh, there's no women. Recently, we had an under 16 team that visited England. They were based at Henley, and they did pretty well, the girls and the boys. So along those lines, you will see that in isolation and in certain pockets of excellence, you find that there is growth and development, but in my opinion, not enough.
So, Chris, what are the barriers then? Is it government support? Is there not enough of that? Is it cultural? Is it barriers within communities? Are you mentioned right at the start about the historical view of women and girls? Has that got to change? And if so, how does that happen?
Look, those are the one. There's a it's a combination of challenges that we're facing. One of the biggest ones is that during the apartheid era we had what we called separate development, and every so-called non-white grouping had to develop on its own. So you have all these areas like Soweto, which is southwestern townships. I'm sure you heard of it. Has a population of in the region of about 2 million people, and that is in a smaller province of the province of Johannesburg. So very few people. So the intermingling, the interracial barriers are still very high in place, and only the young girls that are going to private schools are being exposed to participation in sport. It's not in the curriculum. There's no after-school sport. There has been a bilateral between the Department of Education and the Department of Sport, but nothing is still concrete. Nothing is really, it's all in theory, it's all on paper, it's all in policy, it's in the white paper, it's in our constitution of 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 equal development, but it's not been practiced properly. Then we have the issue of professionalization. I mean, we have professional football in South Africa, but there's no professional women football. So, in comparison to what's happening in Europe, so what we're finding that a lot of the young girls are getting, because the exposure now, we just were knocked out yesterday out of the Women's African Nations Cup, but they had prior won the African Nations Cup, which inspired a lot of girls to participate. So on a university level, we see there's a lot of girls that are coming through to attain bursaries so that they can facilitate their academic growth through sport. You see? So they become student athletes, but at school, it's not still happening. The media is one of the, sorry to bash you up because you're from the media side.
No, please do.
The media doesn't cater for women's sport in South Africa. So you will find that we have a what we call a Hollywood's bet. It's not a professional league, so there's no professional football. They're all part timers. They do their work. Some of the girls that are working work the day and they go to train at night. They train twice a week, which is not enough. They play a game on Saturday. It's occasionally televised when it's a big clash like Mamelodi Sundowns, which is a big team, and perhaps the University of Johannesburg. So we find that these girls are looking for escape. I mean, now there's two of the girls that I managed to get into the university system 3 years ago. The one just finished studies in sports science, and she's been recruited to play in Spain. Another young girl, we just started the first year now that we parents have, you know, in today's world, it's not what you know is but who you know, and we then managed to get her into the system. And now after the engine tournament, she was a top goal scorer in the under 20 engine. It's a local engine petrol station that has these tournaments for young girls and boys. And she was a top goal scorer, player of the tournament, and then she was swooped up by the University of West Virginia. So very soon, what we finding is also that these kids then lose their nationalization. So they don't come back to play for the country. They go and take out American citizenship. They're 20 years old. In 5 years' time, they American citizens. And it's happened to quite a few of our players, and not only South African, but African players that's playing professional football in the big leagues in Europe.
Chris, is professionalisation important in your opinion? Because I'm just thinking that in areas like the UK and Europe and perhaps in the USA now, where there are professional leagues, people talk a lot, don't they, about giving role models, especially giving girls and young women role models to follow. In your academic view and your personal view, does that necessarily follow? If there were more professional leagues in South Africa, would you find young girls wanting to emulate that and to see those as role models, or is that actually a bit of a false thing? Does it not really work that way in reality?
No, look, it has a very big impact from a South African perspective, because you must understand that these girls are also looking at using sport as a vehicle for social change, their status, their lifting their families from poverty. So if they're playing for money, it's a vehicle of trying to raise their status. So if you look at from the men's perspective, and we made a lot of studies from a sports sociological perspective, that we find boys coming from the rural areas to the city to come and play for these big teams, and 80% of them don't make it. And then they are lost to society, because then they take to drugs, they become street kids, they become criminals. So it has a negative impact, the professionalization, but it also has a positive part of it, that they can at least pay for their studies, they can look at their lives differently, that where they come from, the townships, the areas, the poverty that their parents had gone through. We must understand that that the young generation, or these millenniums, their parents were not allowed to study. They were not allowed to go to university. I mean, we fought from a personal perspective. Our first degrees were done correspondently. We couldn't attend university because of the apartheid system. But now there's a route that's open for them. The world is their oyster. They see that they can use sport as a vehicle to change their status. The captain of the Banyana team, that's what they call the girls. The boys are called Bafana because it's the boys. That's a Zulu term. Rafilwe Jane was a student of mine also, and I mean, she in the second year had already been signed for AC Milan, so she's got Italian experience. She's come back. She's increased the studies while she was playing in Italy, and so she's like you said, she's a role model. But other girls are looking at her and saying, "Hey, this is a route that we can take."
How do you see, Chris, organisations? There's the South African Women in Sport Foundation. There's other organisations, of course. How much progress are they making? Do they need more support? Do they need to be doing anything differently? Because the picture you paint is one of perhaps frustration, really, that things aren't happening quickly enough. And do those organisations need more support to make change happen for women and girls?
I think that from a governmental perspective, firstly, we should introduce physical education. When we were at school, we had a Wednesday afternoon where it was you'd play against another high school, or you'd play against another primary school. That needs to come back, because that's where the grassroots. I mean, everything stems from a school perspective. So, firstly, we need to get grassroots going very as a matter of urgency. Like you said, you used a very good word there about frustration, because that's been in the sport industry, we can see we have the solutions, but the cogs of the wheels of change are turning very, very slowly. And more organizations, there are one or two conferences where there's a woman in sport. There are every province that honors the woman that does well in their province, but that's not enough, because we're looking at multitudes. I mean, we should, if our men's Springbok team is doing so well that they've been world champions for the past 4 times, what about our women? How come our women are struggling, and we don't hear of the women's Springbok? And this is why that you will find that amongst the black or the non-white groupings in the apartheid era, we never supported the Springboks. We supported the All Blacks because it was more of a home run for us. You understand?
Yeah.
so those sentiments are still lying deep within the older generation of that Springboks are only for white people. Funny enough, the dynamic of the Springbok team has changed tremendously, but it hasn't changed within the women's Springboks. I mean, we hosted Canada for a 2-game series the past month, and we lost both. And Canada is not a very strong women's participant within sport. We don't do well within the rugby sevens on the circuit. We first have to qualify through the African way, and that's a challenge. The same with the cricket, you see. So women's sport is not only from a political negative side, that marginalization of black women or white women, so forth. I would think generally, on the whole, we need to then increase participation on various levels to community development, community sport, school sport, um, club sport, which is lacking very, 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 very. So we don't have uh, girls club football. They're only starting to play when they get to the university level.
Chris, I said at the start that we'd sort of reflect and look at how things were going to look in the future, perhaps how will success be measured. Just before we do that, I mean, a straightforward question, I suppose, is there the willpower, do you think, in South Africa to make the changes necessary to set up the infrastructure, to have more women and girls involved in leadership roles, perhaps around sport? Do you see a willpower there to make that happen?
There is a willpower, but like I said to you, Andrew, it's still theoretical. It's not been implemented. There's a willpower which is enshrined in our constitution about equality, about enfranchising the disadvantage which women are, not only from a non-white point of view, but they have been disenfranchised for time immemorial because of the patriarchal society that we come from. So we need on every level. We need in leadership. We need administration. We need in coaching. Many of the girls' football teams are still coached by males. It is only recently now that we have an ex-player, Desiree Ellis, who has been now promoted as the woman national coach. But before then, prior to her, we had a Vera Pauw, which was hailed from the Netherlands. But prior to her, it was only coached by males. And that has, again, a negative impact on the development of girls, because now you look at the issue of bullying, you look at the issue of gender-based violence, you have to look at all those other safety measures about the development of girls, because you cannot develop them along the same lines that you develop in the boys. You see, and so the world is there, but it's going to take us some time to implement. And I'd like to engage the minister. We'll hear this afternoon, but I don't think he'll want to engage me. He'll avoid all the issues. But we should engage all these role players, because only through the proper allocation of the resources will we be able to get it. I mean, here we're still fighting at, we, like I said, we're retired, but out of the system is very few administrators, very few coaches, very few leaders within the field, within the field. And sport, like I say, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And it's sad to think that it's happening along the male route, but the women are still being marginalized.
And we're of a similar generation, Chris. So we've seen, you in particular have seen massive changes there in South Africa during our lifetimes. Looking at the current young generation of women and girls, how long do you think they're going to have to wait then before they see the kind of platforms for girls and young women to be involved in sport that are currently enjoyed, in Europe, in America, and Australia, New Zealand as well? How long do you think that's going to take?
Oh, that's a very difficult one, Andrew, because like I say, you still have, in a South African perspective of women, you still have pockets of excellence. It's not on a major drive to say we are going to make the change. So there is pocket of excellence in athletics. There's pocket of excellence in football. Like I said, now 2 of my players have, one to Spain, one to the USA. We have We have some of our top players in the national team that are playing in Mexico. Others are playing in the Netherlands. So these girls are starting to see that they can utilize their talent to alleviate the poverty back home. That's one of the issues. The other thing is we do not have enough role models. You know, the Penny Haynes that won gold medals in swimming, they are off the scene. We don't hear about them anymore. Uh, we had very few of gold medalists in Olympics. I know Lawrence is very deeply involved from a university perspective in the terms of rowing and trying to get girls rowing on a bigger scale. So those are the incentives because, again, like we said, one of the issues that's causing the marginalization is the media. They don't record these things. You don't see it. It's not out in their faces. Whereas professional football, oh, all the boys are playing football now because the season is starting. Um, my alumni had won the World Club Championship, Chelsea, and it's on every boy's. Who do you like? Oh, I like Cole Palmer. So he's a beacon of light. And Cole comes from Jamaica. He's got a big background of poverty. His grandfather. So can you understand the ripple effect it has on, but not in a woman perspective?
Just going to say one last word really around this then. For everything we've discussed here, and thank you for that. It's been excellent talking to you. But for everything we've discussed, do you have hope? Do you hope that this
I
will
have hope. I
progress?
don't have hope. Only I don't have hope, and I mean I'm still involved in a very big scale within the Players Association, within Africa development, because it has an impact on the whole of Africa because these are the same challenges that we're facing. We hope that we've got strong hope and faith that the G20 politically, the geopolitical situation, is hosted by South Africa this year, and one of the agenda points is about women and their participation and in all levels, in leadership, in politics, in the economy, and sport is a mirror of society. Whatever happens in society is going to be reflected in the sport industry. So hopefully there's a positive impact and more opportunities can be created, and the government sits up and listens and implements the constitution as it rightfully is supposed to be. And and then we most probably, we say when there's smoke there's fire, and hopefully it sets a light on a bigger scale.
Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. And I really do hope that the government ministers you're going to meet at the conference later do listen to you, because it's been fascinating for me, and I'm sure for our audience, to listen to you on day 5 of our ISC Women's Sports Business Week. Chris Fortuin, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Andrew, it's a pleasure, and I thank you very much for hosting me.